Let's establish a couple of key points right off the bat, because unless a video restricts itself to making one incredibly simple point, its title can't possibly encapsulate the entirety of its arguments, and as such, outrage at its failure to do so must be headed off immediately, it seems. This will not be me dancing over the corpse of SAO, nor will it be me hailing Digibro as some kind of analytical savior who is able to beat back this scourge from our shores. Similarly, this will not be an attack on the man for daring to expose the community to the danger of expressing his opinion when he has enough of a following for that opinion to influence some people. Indeed, this won't be much of a focus on personalities and community figureheads at all, with the focus placed squarely upon the comments made over the commentators who made them. This will be an examination of Sword Art Online itself, the reaction to and community perception of it, and how that perception shifted over time, with Digibro's first video criticizing the series serving as a flashpoint for that shift. Many people who even find the show to be mediocre have gotten tired of the seemingly unending supply of SAO bashing, and I have come to empathize with that feeling and understand why it's gotten old, beyond it simply having happened a lot. Hell, 2 large SAO hate videos have released since I started this script only 2 days ago, an Annie-Sins video on the first season's second arc, and an entry in DX fans' most popular series by miles, Anime I Fucking Hate, focused on SAO2's Mother Rosario arc. I believe myself to be fairly qualified to be the person performing this overview. Beyond merely having a right to the concept by virtue of having conceived it, Digibro has mentioned me as someone who understands both him and his work, and who can often speak on his behalf in places like comments section arguments. However, I'm also an incessant devil's advocate, one for whom very little is sacred, and holding any particular stance is far less interesting than exploring each possible position by occupying it myself for a time. So my empathy for Digibro will not be leading to any excessive fellation of him, at least not in this video. It was fairly recently that I realized just how exasperating SAO hate pieces could be, and being the one who brought them to prominence, Digibro did play a role in this, even if he is often tasked with too great a share of the blame for it. At the time Digibro wrote his first video on Sword Art Online, an analytical diatribe, the series boasted a pretty healthy 8.25 rating on Mal, and was generally viewed as a show with plenty of flaws, but one whose strong production values and really engaging premise overcame those flaws sufficiently to make it a generally enjoyable show. The critics might be a bit harsher on it than its legions of fans, but they wouldn't speak too poorly of the series. As with most incredibly popular anime, it was fairly divisive, with a large contingent of people decrying it as being terrible, but as evidenced by that Mal rating, they weren't that large or influential. It was one of the most dominant topics of discussion for a while, but only 4 months after it ended, Attack on Titan began airing, becoming an even larger phenomenon, and so causing this discourse to settle into the background a bit, and for the conclusions about SAO to by and large remain as they were when it initially wrapped up. Let's now take a look at some of the most noteworthy reviews of SAO at that time then, going through them chronologically. Glass Reflections started us off, getting his review up on January 7th of 2013, just 2 weeks after SAO's first season had finished airing. Now this review is somewhat odd in that it contains fairly heavy criticism of the show, without too many positives, and yet the meticulously calculated score it ends up receiving is a 7.5 out of 10, with the puzzling comment from Arcada that, though the show may have plummeted from an attempted rise up the mountain of anime greatness, the ride down was, to some degree, highly enjoyable, if for no other reason than to just watch the continuous supply of fail. He rounds things off by saying the series gets, quote, major props for having an ending that could have been much worse. What we see here is Sword Art Online being spoken of much more positively than you'd think it should be viewed by this person considering the pros and cons they offer. They just don't really add up, and somehow, someway, SAO's quality is being perceived as greater than the sum of its parts. There's dissonance here, and whether that dissonance is between how his critical side viewed it and how much he ended up enjoying it, or between his actual opinion on the series and the one he expresses in order to not upset the masses too greatly is up in the air, but it's certainly there. Giguk's review 2 weeks later was a good deal more internally consistent, and lets us see some of the real oddities at the core of the reaction to SAO. He both fleshes out the aspects he finds appealing about the series more, and gives it a score, 6.5, that feels like it lines up much more closely with the tone he takes towards it. The basic core idea of his video is that Sword Art Online has a lot of flaws, but is quite entertaining, with him going so far as to say that he was, quote, never once bored while watching the show. In fairness, he does note that this was achieved in part through the entertainment value for him of the stupidity of its later episodes, so he does make room for some of that so bad it's good appeal. So what now emerges as a critical stance on SAO is that it has a lot of flaws, but through how engaging its premise is and how solid the presentation is, it manages to remain enjoyable, with those flaws at least serving to be somewhat interesting and keep things from getting as dull as they could have been. I was able to find one somewhat prominent YouTube review that expresses the full, unbridled love for the series that many experience, though. That video having been made by Shadow ACS, and posted on February 18th. Seeing its appeal explained by someone who experienced it in full force is really elucidating. He's a big fan of fantasy and romance, and the prospect of a fantasy series with a heavier than usual focus on its romantic elements was exactly what he'd always wanted. He was really intrigued by the trapped in the video game premise, and noted his surprise that he, quote, hasn't seen this setup in any other shows or movies, when it seems like a premise that would have a really strong appeal. This brings up a point many of SAO critics will make, that to enjoy it you must not have seen many other anime. That argument is a bit too extreme for this instance. He may have seen lots of anime and just not seen any Digimon or .hack stuff, but the basic point still makes itself clear. For so many people to have been so captivated by this series that the premise could dazzle them to a degree that would make these flaws non-issues or relatively minor ones, it must have achieved that through some degree of novelty. Another big point he makes is the stakes added to Kirito and Asuna's relationship by the unpredictability of their situation that he says is created due to it taking place within this fantasy setting, and the looming threat of tragedy and danger for Kirito and Asuna, which we'll get back to a little later. Perhaps the most telling section is where he discusses the action, though. He says that what makes action work is not the fighting itself, but the tension that results from it, arguing that said tension is created through having an investment in the characters involved in that fight. This is it. Every element comes back to this captivation with the premise. The relationship of the characters is made noteworthy because of the weight this setting and this setup add to it, and it all extends out from there, with every other element, like these action scenes, being fueled by that resulting investment in the characters. If you've been hooked, you can be along for the entire ride. Finally, to cap things off, he touches upon Kirito, with one very important and interesting omission. He does criticize the character a bit, although he says it's more of a nitpick than anything else on his part, saying that Kirito's personality might be a little too understated. What he does not bring up whatsoever is the irrationality of Kirito's actions. Digibro opens his video on SAO by criticizing Kirito, and does so because it's such a strong argument to make. Kirito gets people killed because he hit his power level, and then continues to do so even after that, resulting in more hardships. Kirito waits to start using a skill that allows him to dispense of a boss with almost no trouble at all for no apparent reason, the artificial drawing out of that battle that occurs as a result of that leading to the deaths of some of those fighting in it. All of this illogic was a total non-issue for ACS, presumably because he was simply too invested to notice or care at this point. Demolition D came in a few months later with his own review, which, while brief, says once again that there are a number of head-scratching flaws, but that things like the pretty decent romance and a cool fight at the end before resolving its narrative with what he calls a nice conclusion make it worthwhile. The big noteworthy development here is his clear separation of the Alfheim Online arc as a distinct and terrible entity. Giguk and Arcada both mentioned stuff getting stupider in it, and ACS said that while he remained totally invested throughout it, he could see how others might be bothered by things like a somewhat contrived setup and Asuna's relegation to a damsel in distress. But Demo really came out and said it just isn't even worth watching. And this is how the general opinion came to rest. The Aincrad arc has its stumbles, but is overall pretty cool and fun, and the Alfheim arc can be where the vast majority of ire gets directed, with even most SAO fans being comfortable with letting it be the scapegoat for negative reactions to the show. It would be almost a year later that Digibro's video came out and changed everything. What Digibro did that had not been done up until that point was really dig into those things that were mostly mentioned in general terms in the prior discussions of the series. Those issues, whose presence was almost always acknowledged in reviews, unless you write for Kotaku, that is. Taking clear influence from Red Letter Media's seminal Plinkett reviews, Digi unpacked the flaws to a degree which had been unseen by most until this video. For the first time, people were confronted with both the sheer number of strange plot, character, and world-building inconsistencies there were, and with the severity of those holes, some of them being so gaping as to entirely break the logic of the show for many once they realized them. Here's the most significant paradigm shift this information caused, though. It made it look dumb to like SAO. Obviously, in the eyes of many, it remained totally fine to do so, and obviously many did continue to do so. But with almost as many people having viewed it as those who have it listed on their MAL profiles, this video confronted the community with the fact that if from no other standpoint than a technical writing one, Sword Art Online was not good. Why is it that Digibro in particular had this revelation? What made him the first one to break this news, nearly 2 years after Sword Art Online began airing? This is actually one of the most interesting points of this whole discussion. In short, it is because of the somewhat unique circumstances of his viewing of SAO. Digibro is someone who understands his taste very precisely, and can tell early on whether or not an anime will appeal to him. As someone who wants to experience as much of the medium as he can, Digi does not hesitate to drop series, and drop them early, if he determines that they won't be worthwhile for him. He initially did just that, dropping SAO 7 episodes into it, but the constant questions about his opinions on the series, since he was someone who talked about anime, got him to finally watch the whole series so he could give his thoughts on it and put that questioning to rest. A lot of anime fans, especially those so invested in the community that they are able to appeal and relate to it well enough to grow, and who have strong desires to contribute to the overall discussion, enjoy getting swept up in these anime crazes and going along for the ride. This is how people like Giguk came away saying it was a decent time. They watched it week to week, were able to have their imaginations sufficiently captured by the show's evocative premise, had a bunch of fun with all the memes, and as he described, this viewing experience led to even the bad bits being enjoyable in their own way, often with the help of said memes. This is not how Digibro experienced Sword Art Online. He marathoned it with his brother for the purpose of determining and sharing his opinion on it, filming his reactions along the way. Marathoning a series makes those inconsistencies, contrivances, and holes stand out more, because there isn't that week-long gap during which you can forget specifics to the point where you'll just assume there was some explanation for what's happening in this week's episode that you aren't recalling. The other key point here is that Digi is someone who would have dropped the series had he not possessed an audience pining for his thoughts on it. The reason almost everyone who talked about it was saying that SAO was able to hold up and remain somewhat engaging through all the flaws is that if you were someone who reached a point where that stopped being the case, where a fascination with the world didn't lead you to overlook some of those issues, you likely just dropped it right there. Being one of those relative few whose attention couldn't be averted away from the flaws to actually finish the series in spite of that, Digibro was describing these issues to an extent that most who watched it simply hadn't realized they were present. So yeah, people for whom the flaws were just a bit of a nagging feeling as they watched it, those who were thinking of the show as a 6 or 7 out of 10, now knew what that feeling had been, and thought, oh, well the show really was dumb, wasn't it? People who had watched a bit and dropped it were validated, and could point to this video and say, see, I told you it was stupid. Those who hadn't watched it at all would likely say, damn, well I guess the hype was overblown and this show isn't good. Because agree with it or not, Digi's video is a well-constructed argument, in terms of sweeping you up into his experience with the show and the thorough reasoning behind it. The stance that had been taken, that you could attribute most of SAO's ills to its second arc, with the first still having flaws but being a fun time overall, was an absolute boon to this structure of Digi's. With him being able to point to so many flaws in the first arc, and then, with tremendously effective dramatic payoff, move into what was actually the quote-unquote bad part of the show. Now those who liked the series were forced to play defense. And with nearly every prominent critic having not been in love with the series to begin with, the SAO fanbase never really got themselves a heavy hitter to step up to that plate. The argument from Giguk and Arcada and Demo had been that the premise and presentation had been strong enough to cover up its flaws. But now that Digibro had come along and laid out just how numerous and severe they were, the perception started to be that for one to ignore these flaws, they'd have to be blind to them, to have low standards or bad taste. The great irony here, of course, is that this video was never framed as an indictment of people for having an experience that was different from Digibro's. He begins the video by explicitly stating that he doesn't begrudge anyone for enjoying SAO, that the fact a piece of media is able to make so many people happy is something to be celebrated, and that his video is merely here to express his own experiences with it, and why the show made him feel that way. The fact is that in order to enjoy Sword Art Online, you do need lower standards of a sort, or at least a higher tolerance for some contrivances. Remember when I told you to take note of the tension ACS found present in Kirito and Asuna's relationship, making it stand out? If, like Digibro, you had realized early on just how totally amazing and invincible Kirito was being framed as, you may have had the experience Digibro described while discussing the infamous scene where Kirito's health regen is greater than the combined damage of an entire group of 5 players who attack him. Any feeling that Kirito might ever be in any danger for the rest of the show is effectively ended. It's something that many people did likely realize, and that realization would cause a good deal of them to drop the series right there. This moment, perhaps more than any other, was likely a crossroad. If SAO's contrivances and flaws are too much for you, you would drop it here. And if you can make it through this scene with some shred of your suspension of disbelief intact, and some investment in Kirito remaining, you are likely someone for whom SAO's flaws wouldn't break the show. All of that tension ACS said he experienced would not be felt by those who saw what this scene tells the viewer, which is that Kirito is totally and unquestionably invincible. And as cynical as that outlook may seem, it is proven to be entirely correct by the fact that the series goes as far as allowing Kirito to literally will himself back from the dead. You either need to be easier to get so invested in a series and its concept that you can overlook flaws, or not care as much about those contrivances as Digibro does in order to enjoy it more than he did. In some instances, you do just need to be ignorant of what the series is cluing you in on, because if you aren't, then none of it should surprise you, which is how that perception of liking SAO being dumb was able to come about. Nowhere does Digi attempt to argue that having that experience, that possessing that greater tolerance for contrivances is a bad thing, or makes you a bad person. Nor do I personally believe that possessing a greater number of anime that you will be able to enjoy watching is somehow a negative. But in a culture where Twilight and Transformers have made signaling just how much you hate these bad pieces of media and how that makes you so refined and critical something to take pride in, a huge number of people have the instinct to find inherent virtue in making such critiques, and inherent vice in liking these things that are flawed. The most significant force at play here that led to SAO's fall from grace wasn't Digi disliking it, but instead the fact that our culture is such that through the revelation of all these reasons to dislike the series, people felt an ingrained desire or obligation to do so. And of course him pointing out a number of legitimate issues with the series that many people may not have considered caused their scores of SAO to drop once they realized that. What a long fall it was though, from an 8.25 to a 7.82, which for perspective makes it go from the 254th highest rated anime to the 854th. And make no mistake, Digibro did wish for that to happen. While he bears no ill will towards fans of the series itself and sees no inherent flaw in them for liking it, he himself clearly does not like it. Couldn't really see how so many others did in the face of all of SAO's flaws, and did wish for his viewpoint to spread throughout the community so that others would realize what he saw in it to make him dislike it so much. With that mission accomplished, though, he could happily move on and... Oh wait. Part 14.5639. Digi takes a fucking sledgehammer to SAO2's kneecaps. You'll have to forgive me for the cliffhanger here, but the second half of this video is where a lot of these trends and ideas come into their own and reveal some really interesting insights about SAO and the reaction to it. So be sure to subscribe to be alerted when part 2 comes out in a little while here. A huge thank you to Chelsea Chester, Joji Matthews, Culver James Kamai, Chris Wagner, and all of the other patrons who are making this possible.